Well, tēnā koutou katoa, everyone, and kia ora. So I'm Don Christie, I'm from New Zealand, and this talk I thought I'd give today because it's a keynote. It wouldn't be technical, it wouldn't really be about Mahara or Moodle. It's really about the context in which we're working and the importance of keeping our stacks, whether it's our knowledge stack or technology stacks, open. I'm also going to, at some stage, reference some Māori concepts, which is, the indigenous New Zealand people's concepts about knowledge and knowledge management. And I just have to emphasise, especially as I'm not in New Zealand, that I'm not Māori and I'm not speaking for Māori people. I'm speaking about stuff that I'm learning through that process and how it applies to how we develop tools like Mahara, Koha and Moodle. So just a little bit about myself. I've lived in New Zealand for 30 years. I consider myself a New Zealander, and I quite like it. That's Wellington on a good day. But I'm also a former developer. I used to cut C code, which I learned how to do here. And 22 years ago, myself and 5 other people started this strange company called Catalyst IT in Wellington. We've now got 300 staff. We decided from the get-go it'd be an open source company, a company that used open source technology and applied it in a way that was enabling and appropriate for our clients. Back in about 2003, we got involved in Moodle. We were assessing learning management systems to build a single cluster for the entire polytechnic sector in New Zealand. So in 2003, we evaluated Moodle, and we thought that was probably the best place to start. And we built this cluster for 40,000 students. When I roll over a few years on from that, and all the contributions we made to Moodle in those early years, the largest client that we had was a Middle Eastern client, and they had 4 million learners running on one Moodle instance, and having to complete courses every week in order to get their benefits or their doles. So we've done a lot in Moodle, but I think one of the projects that makes me most proud and still gives me the shivers in a way is Mahara, because that's a project that Catalyst actually leads. We started it back in 2006 as a bit of an experiment to look at ideas that were coming out about lifelong learning, student-centered learning and all that sort of stuff. And it's carried on, Mahara, and it's got to a stage now where there's about 70,000 downloads a year of Mahara. But more importantly, it's got to a stage now where people are actually beginning to use it and beginning to apply it in ways that are very much built into the learning experience. Before that, people weren't really sure how these e-portfolio tools should be used. So I think we're at quite an interesting point there. So over the last 22 years, I've sort of witnessed how open source has impacted technology, impacted education. Just one more thing about myself, as has already been said, I'm an alumni of what was called at the time Gloucester College of Arts and Technology. I lived in halls on this campus, and I discovered last year that a longtime friend of mine in Wellington, Mike Riversdale, was also a student here, and he would like me to send his regards. Mike, like myself, owe quite a lot to this institution. When I was 18, I wasn't really sure what I was going to do with my life. I was a bit aimless. Somebody said to me, "Oh, you're okay at maths, Dom. Why don't you look at these computers?" And the courses that we were taught here, the computer studies courses, were really, really great. They taught us some real fundamentals. They were very well curated. They were very well targeted at the students coming through as opposed to Microsoft or Cisco or somebody else. And so I learned a lot from that, and I'd like to just reflect Mike's comments back to you. I'd also like to say just how damn proud I am that Mahara is used in this institution. And that, by the way, is a photograph of where my halls of residence used to be, I think, just out there, where all the flowers are now growing. So things change. So I'm just going to briefly go through about 4 topics, and then I wasn't sure how long this talk was going to take, so I thought there'd be time at the end. And as I said, it feels to me like we're at a bit of a turning point for education in general, but also for where tools like Mahara fit in that narrative and that future. So if there's time for a bit of a discussion around that at the end of this talk, I'd love you to have your thinking hats on now and see what we stimulate. A few years ago, Catalyst in New Zealand changed our stance, and instead of being technologists applying tools like Mahoodle or Mahara, the library management system, or Mahara, we talked much more about open knowledge, which was kind of the outcome that we were seeking. And if you look up the definitions of open knowledge, they're all around the fact that knowledge should be free to be reused, transparent, shared, collaborated with. Very much the same as open source software. It's free to be reused, shared, and changed without constraints. It's a really important concept, this. A story I often tell is from my own family's background, where my grandmother, my Granny Fraser, who grew up in the northeast of Scotland. She was part of a rural poor community in the northeast there. And towards the end of the First World War, she was 12, and she had to leave school. She was at the top of her class at the time, but she had to go home and help her ailing mother and look after her younger brothers. And for her whole life, she resented that fact that she hadn't been able to complete her education. And she was probably one of the smartest women I've ever known. And her life was one of damn hard work in, quite hard rural circumstances. So, for example, when her husband died, she didn't have a house to live in. She had to go and find a new life in Aberdeen, in the city. Her two daughters, though, my mother and my aunt, they grew up just after the Second World War, when education became free up to and beyond tertiary level. So at the age of 18, despite their father's opposition, my mother and her sister were both encouraged to go to university, and they both went to university. And for those two women, getting a tertiary level qualification changed the economic situation of my family just in the space of 20 years, when that free education was available. And so, to me, the idea of freely accessible knowledge and open knowledge is very personal, because my family's trajectory was changed completely just by that one change in policy in the UK. And it's not unique. We know all the evidence that shows that. I was actually born in Zambia in Africa, and lived there for quite a while. This is Matuuka High School, which is a community high school in the west of Zambia that I visited about 5 years ago. They have about 70 students in their class. The community finances the school, and I love these quotes that the headmaster put on the wall. When books are opened, we discover that we have wings. The problem for schools around the world, particularly in poorer parts of the world, is the books are getting more and more shut. And this is something I'm going to try and explore in this talk, is how much we're locking down knowledge and making it unavailable to the people that could most benefit from it. So that's my thing about open knowledge. And so I've been a big proponent for open data and open knowledge for a long time. But I've also had to change my thinking a little bit. And, excuse me, this talk is being videoed, so as I say, I'm not representing Indigenous Maori people. I'm representing what I'm learning from Maori New Zealanders, my fellow New Zealanders. Last year, I was involved in a project with the National Library, and I was talking a lot about, open knowledge and opening up the content that was being created. And a Maori lady pulled me up, and she said, "Don, what do you know about Matarangi Māori?" And I said, "Well, I don't." And this is the knowledge systems, the traditional knowledge systems of Indigenous Maori people in New Zealand. And I think you have to understand that often when we talk about Indigenous populations that have been colonised by Europeans in particular, we're talking about populations who have ended up in a situation where they are a minority in their own land. It's quite hard to understand, perhaps, for us here in the UK, but they're a minority in their own land, and their culture and their belief systems and their knowledge systems are threatened. And often those systems and the data that's collected about them is used against them in ways that they never imagined. So Matarangi Māori is a knowledge systems that Māori have that was passed on from generation to generation orally, that describe their genealogy, their beliefs, everything around them. And it was very well curated. It was a very important task. The wanaga, the people that looked after that knowledge, were very important people in iwi, because it brought the past to the future. So the knowledge of the past was passed on to the tamariki, the children, for their future benefit. And that knowledge was very well curated. And so the whole idea that knowledge should just be freely shared without any clear curation, without any clear idea of what it was meant to be used for and what the outcomes were supposed to be used for, was an anathema, or could be an anathema to Māori, particularly if it's used in the wrong way. So, for example, the curators of that knowledge, the wanaga, might have said to me that the story I just told you about my grandmother, I didn't have the mana, I didn't have the right to tell you that story, because it could be said that actually it's my mother's story, or my aunt's story, or my sister's story. I would need to get the status and the recognition of my ability to curate that story in order to be able to tell that story. So I'm going to try and tie this theme into further themes, but again, if you think about the position that many of you here are in, you're curating knowledge for an outcome that is a future outcome. And, you know, in the last 2 years, or 3 or 4 years, when certainly overseas, we've been looking at Brexit, we've been looking at Donald Trump, we've been looking at fake news and just wondering what the heck is going on. You know, more and more people are thinking, well, actually, knowledge creation is a really important thing for us and for our future. And the second concept that goes hand in hand with the Mātauranga Māori is Katakitanga. And this is the system of guardianship and stewardship and trust that Māori has. A lot of it applies to nature and the land use and use of resources like fish and farming and so on. But again, there is an idea that Katakitanga is something that is very, very important for your family, for your whānau, for your extended family, and for your iwi, your broader tribe. And within this, one of the things that a lot of Indigenous people have suffered from is the fact that the information that they have passed up to their fellow citizens has been misappropriated, not looked after, not treated as a taonga, a treasure, and therefore devalued and downgraded. So very interestingly, right now, Māori have a claim against the New Zealand government where they're claiming that their health data, their personal data, and also their cultural data is a taonga, a treasure. And that means that they are claiming back certain rights over that information that the government had assumed that they wouldn't have. Now, if they're successful in that claim, that could actually have, I believe, quite profound implications for the rest of New Zealand society, because it would mean that we would have to take much more care of our data and our knowledge systems in general. Sometimes it's quite hard to say, well, that piece of health data, that DNA record of health data that maybe was collected from me, doesn't also apply to someone else in your society. So, for example, we know that if you give up your DNA records, you're probably also giving up your family's DNA records. You're giving up a lot of other people's DNA records. If that's sold to an insurance company, what impact will that have? If somebody decides that eugenics is a good idea again in the future, what impact will that have? So this whole idea that data is a treasure and needs to be curated as well is quite a powerful concept within Māori New Zealanders. So I don't know. I see a lot of tensions within the knowledge sector at the moment. On the one hand, there's a mass aggregation of content, of data, of student data, and it's creating opportunities for new knowledge and for cost-cutting and for lots of exciting things to happen. On the other hand, we are potentially losing our identity. We're potentially losing our ability to curate courses that actually are useful to me or useful to somebody in a specific job at a specific point in time. Or to take a very simple example, if my 5-year-old is at school and they're being taught to count to 10, if they use some aggregated content, they may use the word sweet potato for sweet potatoes, which might seem normal to you, except in New Zealand we call sweet potato by their Māori name, kumara. And so if all of a sudden we start using some aggregated content source for learning how to count, then potentially we lose the word kumara, which is just part of our culture and our blendedness in New Zealand. That's just a tiny little example, but it's kind of like the death by 1,000 cuts type thing that happens when we lose the opportunity to maybe take some great content and then curate it for ourselves. So if that original knowledge is not open enough to allow us to create what we wanted to create. You may have all seen that Turnitin was sold for something billion dollars recently. I mean, I kind of think that Turnitin is quite an evil concept. I think this idea that we treat our students as cheats, from the get-go is a bit weird. When I was a student, I could easily copy a paragraph from a book and nobody sent it to Turnitin to say, Don, you cheated. If I was unlucky, the tutor might have said, that looks a bit odd, Don. You might want to go and reference that or take it away. But what we've done is create this huge database that is being mined. And we're not just doing that, we're giving assessment to Turnitin, we're giving student records, massive, massive database. I have this dystopian future, which I went on about at length at one stage, whereby using machine learning and artificial intelligence, Turnitin and platforms like that could effectively predict, from a very early age, how well somebody was going to achieve academically. Okay, which is okay, but then maybe, for the people with a bit of money, they could just give them that certificate straight away and maybe not have to bother with the pain of actually learning because they were going to learn so well anyway. Which is kind of, a massive extension of the relationship that Eton and Oxford have. But I just think these models where we're handing over huge amounts of data to huge centralized systems are not the way we should be curating for the future. So in this future that is dominated by the likes of Turnitin or Canvas or whatever, where they're already mining data in ways that nobody gave them permission to do. Nobody knows what newer software algorithms are going to be able to do with that data. Nobody knows what value or not might be taken from it, or what decisions might be made about you or your students or your students' children in the future. And I think this is where the calamity is that my sense is that we're sleepwalking into these situations without working out why we've made these compromises and how we ameliorate them and how we get out of them. So I'm not saying that we're not going overnight we'll stop using them, but we're not, in my view, taking enough care. We're not taking enough curative care of our systems. I also think that our thinking is changing, and I think these centralized homogenous systems can't hold and they can't survive. So New Zealand's actually playing a bit of catch-up with the UK, so forgive me if I'm sort of going over a bit of old ground with you at the moment, but the New Zealand government is, the new government came in and they'd spent, quite a long time in opposition thinking about what they call the future of work. It's not a new concept, but they, like many of us, recognize that jobs are changing, they're changing at a pace. And they, a lot of them also grew up, sometimes as students like myself, in the 1980s, where when there were big changes in our society and big changes in the structures of how we worked, people were just dumped on the streets. You know, when unemployment was 12% here in the UK, it wasn't a great place to live in, and people weren't given the tools and the capabilities that they needed to transition from one job to another. So in New Zealand, there's now a lot of talk about what's being called just transition. So this is the idea that jobs are going to change, they're going to change continuously, and we as a society need to be giving the people the tools to cope with change on an ongoing basis. So effectively, we're looking at our current job as training for our next job. And it's up to, you know, being a Labour-led government, they believe it's, you know, the state has a role to play in doing that. And of course, you know, we're back to good old lifelong learning, which we've been talking about for 15 years. We're back to micro-credentials, also known as badges. We're back to a bunch of different things. We're looking at competency, skills, and capability frameworks. Which ones should they be? Do we have a skills framework or a competency framework? What's the context? Does it change? How quickly does it change? You know, if our jobs are changing really quickly, do we, as institutions like this university, how do we adjust our matrices on an ongoing basis? Now, I know that's what we do already, but like, how do we do it fast enough? And then how do we turn those competencies into, I don't know, a degree or a diploma or something that's broader than just that micro-credential? And who are the people that are able to say, well, now you've got enough of those little things to get a big thing? I don't believe that having our systems on one major homogeneous, cloud-based thing is going to be the answer. I don't think that we can be waiting for, let's say, US organizations or Singaporean organizations or whoever it might be to develop the tools that we need to meet these challenges which are happening right now. And so this is where I do come back, if you're just wondering where this talk is going, where I come back to open source. Because that is the way we can build the tools. That is the way we can build the minimal viable products. That is the way we can experiment without too much risk and so on. And that is the way that we can say, okay, we can work together, we can collaborate. You do this, you do that, and you do that, and we'll pull it together and we'll see if it works. And if it doesn't really matter. We'll try something else. And at the same time, you're not losing control over the things that are important, over the future of knowledge. So yeah, I couldn't come to a Mahoodle conference and not have a Mahara slide. I think Sam would kill me. And I do think this is the future, and it's interesting the talks that a lot of the talks will be today. Darren Kent talking about apprenticeships. Is Darren here?
Darren's not able to come until this afternoon.
Right.
We'll try and squeeze Darren in this afternoon. But,
yeah. So those of you that don't know Darren, he runs an organisation called TPM in Worcester, I think. He came to our Catalyst first Christmas lunch in Britain. We've been in the UK for over 10 years now. And he's been using Mahara in an apprenticeship situation for a long time. The reason that universities are beginning to use Mahara now is for apprenticeship degrees, which is fascinating. But I'm also aware that we're at a turning point and we don't know what it is that those apprenticeship degrees really need out of Mahara. I think there's some gaps. In fact, I'm sure there's gaps, but we aren't being told what they are at this stage. There was talk earlier from Dave about using assessment within Moodle, and I know Gavin Hendricks is going to be talking about competencies and smart evidence. There's talk about whether we need a separate assessment tool, sort of independent of Moodle, Mahara, Blackboard, Turnitin, and so on. Should that be open source? If so, what should it look like? So it doesn't have to integrate. We're not tying it tightly to the LMS. And if the what does it look like question is one that we can solve in a iterative way, then we should be talking, right? I'm coming to the end of this talk. open source, I think, works really, really well. Of course, like any software, we can cock it up badly, and we often do. And either in the development phase or in the implementation phase, or all sorts of different ways. Every different way that we've found to cock up software just in generally applies to open source. So it's not a silver bullet, but it does give us the freedoms we need. It does give us the choices we need for the future. And if we do use it and apply it thoughtfully and carefully, it will provide a basis for what we need in the future, I believe. And if you doubt the value of open source, maybe you heard about a deal last year, which is the biggest deal in the software industry to have taken place ever. And that was when IBM started the process of buying Red Hat for $32 billion. Red Hat is an open source company through and through, and IBM valued that at $32 billion. So there's value in what we're doing. People are putting monetary value on that. I think there's a much greater value than that, and that value is our future. So thank you for patiently listening to me. You can now get on to more interesting stuff. I do have a slide with some of the references that go much more deeply into some of the topics that I mentioned, and I assume that will come up on the video. So thank you very much, and if we're ready for, you're probably going to catch up with time.
No, we're fine with time.
Oh, yeah? Oh, cool.
Yeah, okay.
Yes, that's me. Done.